Man, I need some exercise. I've put on a few pounds as of late. Problem is, if I take my chonky self on a nice peaceful hike in the woods, I might just end up as a calorie-heavy snack for some creature who also needs to lose some weight. Now, that would just be rude. Oh, right, this is a horror channel. Here are some allegedly true and very creepy hiking stories to haunt you for weeks. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. Encounter at Laxey Will, from Laserbrand. I'm a New Yorker, but from 1999 until 2001, I lived in the northern UK for school. I attended Manchester University. At the time, I was dating an Irish girl, and she and I decided to go on a trip to the Isle of Man, since the ferry was cheap and we were students with little expendable income. We ordered our tickets and packed our backpacks. We got on the ferry and ended up sparking a conversation with a couple who I won't name, but their family owned a castle that they opened to the public, and they offered us room and board for next to nothing, as it was off-season tourist-wise, and we were poor students who were ecstatic and took the offer. Once on the isle, we were warmly taken care of. One night after dinner with said couple, not sure why, but we started talking about the rich history of the Isle of Man and its unique government. Everything from the TT motorcycle race to world record landmarks. They ended up mentioning the Laxey Will, the world's largest water wheel, and how it's just a short hike from the town of Laxey. We set off the next day and got to Laxey and got a room there. The next morning we were up very early at about 4 a.m. and we set off on our hike to Laxey Will. It was still dark then, our only light being streetlights. Our little tourist map had the hiking trail to the wheel on it. By the time we were up out of town going towards the wheel, the sun was just starting to come up again, and the air was very cool, and everything was getting dewy. There was a paved trail going up to the hill with little unpaved trails going away from it, with grass growing all around. We then found the wheel. It was massive, just huge. We sat down by it and ate some bread and smoked cod. I was sitting to the left of my then girlfriend. I began to hear music faintly in the air, not coming from the town. I looked around wondering where it was coming from, but then just sort of dismissed it. But it grew louder, and I asked my girlfriend if she could hear it. She nodded, but could not pinpoint the direction. Thinking we weren't alone, we stood up and began to look around, thinking that some other hikers were coming. But no one showed up. I finally could tell where the music was coming from though, and I began to walk towards it. I walked up the trail about 100 feet away from the wheel. The music got louder and began sounding really good to me. At this point, I don't recall where my girlfriend was. I continued back and forth on a particular spot on the trail and realized the music was off the trail, seemingly in the grassy hilly meadow ahead of me. I walked off to go closer to it. The music was so alluring, amazing, like every favorite song you'd ever heard wrapped into one. I can't for the life of me label it in any genre. It was in the air and just intoxicating. I pushed forward until I saw a small round clearing in the grass, half expecting maybe a couple of youngsters doing the, with the radio playing. So I slowed down and peeked over into this round clear area cautiously. What I saw, you won't believe. There were no young lovers, but tiny people dancing around and playing, singing to music. I literally rubbed my eyes. Was I hallucinating? But no. There they were, real as day, little blonde and brown-haired people. They had long hair, some braided, some not, and I had trouble discerning the males from females. They were dressed in what I could only call Renaissance outfits. Some had hats on, and there were about 30 of them altogether. They were dancing roughly in a circle with a blonde woman standing in the middle, not dancing, just standing there being tended to by what appeared to be servants. Besides being very small, about 8 to 10 inches tall, she was very beautiful. She had a teal blue dress on and long blonde hair down past her waist. It was braided on her head, like a French braid, then it combined into one braid with tassels at the end. I stood there, watching at least 15 minutes when she looked up at me and linked her eyes with mine. Linked is the word, completely locked. I couldn't look away. She began to walk towards me, and when she did, all the other little people stopped and stared. As she walked, maybe 40 feet away from me, she seemed to grow taller. By the time she was at the edge of the small circle, she was my height. I'm 6'1". I looked behind her, and the little people were still little, but just standing motionless. She briefly turned to her what I call servants, and they fell back. She looked down at the edge of the circle with a sort of cautious look, then stepped into the grass. She walked right up to me and began to speak. She had wide-set eyes that were large and light blue. She had a wide, flat forehead and a long, pointed nose. Her lips were thin, but still full in a way, if that makes sense. She's what I would call a handsome woman. A classic beauty, but more of a caricature. She smelled like a mixture of fresh, cool air and lilac blossoms. Not perfumed, more like it was her natural scent. It too was intoxicating. She began to talk to me, but I could not understand what she was saying. It sounded Scandinavian. That's the only man-made language I can think of that reminded me of this. I could tell she was asking me questions, but I could not understand what. She gestured behind me, as if to ask, did I come from that direction? I said I was sorry to intrude and that I came from the water wheel. She mimicked what I said, but in a questioning tone. My heart was in awe and started to flutter, like when I was a teen talking to a pretty girl. She held out her left hand and I reached out to touch it. Her fingers were beautiful and particularly long, like a good third longer than they should have been. I held out my right hand and held hers. It was warm and soft and quite strongly gripping. She didn't try to pull me, but when I relaxed my hand, she held mine more firmly. She stepped closer so we were face to face. I could feel her breathing on me as she spoke. She was 100% a living thing, even though I still had my doubts. I lifted my left hand towards her face, and she moved her head back, but kept holding my hand. I closed my hand to withdraw it, but she grabbed it and held it to her face. She rested her face in it. She opened her eyes and moved forward to kiss me. That's when I heard my girlfriend absolutely screaming at me. I snapped out of it and looked behind me. My girlfriend was up on the path yelling at me, full bore with her hands to her sides. I turned back and the lady, or whatever she was gone, but I could still feel the residual feeling on my hand from her face. The clearing was there, but all the little people were missing. The sky was dark, like the sun was down again. I ran back to my girlfriend. She said she had looked for me all day, and when she found me, I was just standing there completely motionless, like I was about to kiss someone who wasn't there. She said she was afraid to leave the trail because of stories she had heard when she was growing up in Ireland, stories about the Fae folk. I'd been standing there so long that even people from town had begun looking for me. It was sundown, but for me, it had been early morning when I last spoke with my girlfriend. To this day, I have not lived a single minute without thinking of that woman. My heart physically aches and yearns for her. I honestly don't know what she was, but she couldn't have been human. Something in the Mountains from Paywast. I live with my family, and our house is on the edge of the city near the mountains. In my region, there are lots of suitable places to hike. Some may be a bit dangerous, but nonetheless worth the time to go hiking with friends and staying overnight. My house is in a small neighborhood, and just behind our backyard is a pathway that goes up the hills and into the mountains, not too far away from the house. You get the picture. One day I was working on a project that I had to take to university. It was due the next day. My parents called me downstairs and told me that they were taking my little brother and were going to a family gathering. So I said goodbye and ran back upstairs to continue with my project. After a couple of hours, the project was finally done. I looked at the clock, and it read 5:45 p.m., and the sun was still out. So I decided to go for a quick hike to calm my mind. I got ready, took some gear, and went on the path behind the house. I headed into the mountains. On my way, I saw many wild animals like birds, deer, and squirrels. I even cautiously stumbled upon a bear with some newborns. The only unnatural thing there was a 3-story building which was abandoned long ago, but I'd seen it many times before. It wasn't so unusual for me. The nature was amazing, as always, with the wildlife and calming sounds around me. My adventure couldn't have been better. After some time, I got to a cliff which was one of my favorite places to visit, as it overlooked the neighborhood and the fields beyond it. It also provided the perfect, beautiful view for the sunset. I sat there for a while listening to the music of nature around me, enjoying the cold breeze that was coming down over the mountains. I saw the sunset, took a few pictures, and packed up to head back home. While I was doing so, I noticed something change. The sounds around me went softer, until they were gone. I didn't give it too much thought, as it was a steady change and I only barely noticed it. I was soon on my way. The day was slowly turning into night, and I still could not hear any wildlife around me. On my way, I had to bring out my flashlight, because now it was completely dark. I looked at my watch, and it was now 8:20 p.m. I went down the mountain and past the abandoned building. As I was walking down the path, I heard a loud and chilling shriek that was like a woman's scream, but the sound wasn't right. It was deformed, you could say. I looked behind me to where the sound had come from. No way, I thought. It sounded like it was coming from the building. And instead of thinking of what dangers could await me, I immediately thought that someone was in trouble. After a bit of hesitation, I took out my pocket knife and started to approach the building. When I was about 10 meters from the building, the loud shriek came again, but much louder than before. I began doubting my decision of going inside, but there was no way I was leaving that person in here. I flashed my light into the building and saw the stairway at the end of the hall. I slowly went inside, making sure not to make a single sound because I didn't want to give away my position. I realized that the flashlight could blow my cover, so I turned it off and I put it back in my pocket. There was some very dim moonlight illuminating the hallway, so I could make out where I was going. When I got to the second floor, where there were 4 rooms, and after checking all of them, I found that they were empty. The sound must have come from the 3rd floor. As I was making my way up to the stairs, I heard a loud thud followed by another shriek. When I was closer, I was certain that whatever was making that sound wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. Then, for some reason, curiosity maybe, I made the decision that I will regret for the rest of my life. I decided to investigate the weird noise and went looking for it. I went upstairs and began my search. The first room was empty, then I noticed that the door of the 3rd was half open. I went closer and slowly opened it. The light of the moon came in from the broken window, illuminating a small part of the room, but it was mostly dark. As my eyes were scanning the room, trying to find whatever was the source of the noise, I heard it again, like someone laughing with their mouth closed. This sent chills down my spine. And then I finally saw it. There in the corner of the room, 2 yellow eyes, nearly 7 feet off the ground, and they were pointed right at me. My mind stopped. I couldn't think at all. I couldn't even react. Then the creature spoke. Its voice was deep, and it rumbled in my stomach as it echoed throughout the building. It said,
"You shouldn't have come here."
The shock from hearing it talk forced me out of my paralysis. With my mind returned to me, I immediately began to run. As I got to the stairs, I turned back to look at the room, and my soul almost left my body, because there in the door, I saw the thing peering its head into the hallway looking at me. That was it for me. I ran like never before in my life. I made it back downstairs in just a couple of seconds and ran out of the building into the moonlight. As I was running down the path, I heard the shriek one last time. I stopped for a second and looked back at the building. There in the broken window on the 3rd floor were those yellow eyes piercing into my soul. I started running again, never stopping until I got back home. My parents were home and became concerned about my situation. I didn't tell them what happened. I told them instead that I was chased by a bear. Fortunately, it's been 4 months since we moved from that house, and I hope whoever moves into it stays far away from that abandoned building. The Dark Entity, from Anonymous. My friends and I went to Sagada, located in the mountain province of Philippines. We arrived at 10 in the morning and checked in at the lodge, which we had booked prior to the trip. We rested for a while and had some lunch. Then we decided to go spelunking at Sumaguing and Lumiang caves. In the evening, while having dinner, we got acquainted with someone who asked us to come with her and watch the sunrise at Kiltapan Peak. It was a 2-hour hike, so we agreed to meet up with her around 4 in the morning. After having a few drinks at a local pub, we went back to the lodge. I looked at my watch and found that it was already 11 in the evening. My friends are already asleep on a separate bed, and all the lights are off except the one coming from the balcony. For some unknown reason, though I was exhausted at the time, I felt restless. As a habit, I would grab my iPad and start checking Facebook, scrolling down until I got sleepy and dozed off. It wasn't long when my sleep was interrupted by movement in my room. I thought it was one of my friends already awake and preparing for the hike. I found it weird, because earlier that day he had set up his phone as an alarm, but I hadn't heard the sound. I would usually lie on my stomach when I sleep. I guess I was too tired that time, so I didn't bother to turn around and have a look. Suddenly, I felt a hand touch my back, and I thought it was him trying to wake me up. Odd, I felt as though the hand seemed bigger than his, and the fingers were strangely long. I turned around and was extremely horrified. This wasn't my friend, but a very dark, smoke-like figure with pointed ears and red, fiery eyes. I let out a loud scream. It woke my friends up, and immediately all the lights turned on as they panicked. I looked around and noticed that it was already gone. Everyone was looking at me, worried. I told them what happened, but they thought I had a nightmare. I told them that I hadn't slept, but they continued to claim that it was a dream. But I know it was real. After that, we never went back to sleep. We had our coffee and headed downstairs to meet up with our new friend and to begin the hike up to the mountain. There were only 4 of us, yet I felt another presence among us. During the hike, we passed by a lamppost, and that's when I noticed that everyone else had a single shadow, but mine had another to it. Another figure being cast by a light source that just wasn't there. It was then that I realized that the thing from the night before might be following me. I didn't want to worry everyone else, so I kept my distance from the group and I stayed quiet. Even though we were being guided by a map, we got lost nearly the entire day, taking several routes that only got us more lost. We ran into a number of dead ends that didn't even appear on the map. We even went beyond the trail. We somehow managed to reach our destination though, and when we did, I finally felt better. But on our way back, our new friend asked why I looked so distressed the whole time. But I said I was just tired. When in town, I asked around from the locals. I was shocked to find out that they had lore about this very occurrence, stating that many folks who go into or around those caves end up having something attached to them, as the land around those caves is a burial ground. That was something I was never told, otherwise I wouldn't have gone in the first place. After I got back home, the attachment seemed to have left me, and I couldn't have been more thankful. I'll never trespass on burial grounds again, and if I'm not sure about the land around me, it's better to be safe than sorry. Stalked by Something, from Luke. I'm 17 years old and don't really believe in the paranormal. Now, me and my friend Dylan, who's also 17, often go on hikes late at night every few days a week. During this time, we never experience anything out of the ordinary, but that would change. On one of these hikes one night, I suggested we do something a little bit more exciting and maybe a bit silly. I thought it'd be fun to play with a Ouija board in the middle of the night in the middle of the woods. He agreed with a broad grin, telling me it was a ridiculous idea, but he was all in for it. We had a tight budget, so we had to print the Ouija board ourselves and use a glass as a substitute for a planchette. The following night, approximately at 10 p.m., we headed out. I had a rucksack with the Ouija quote-unquote board in it, some newspaper to sit on, and a bit of food. We hiked to the nearest forest, where I knew the location of a ruined monastery. It was already pitch black, and it took a while for our eyes to adjust to the darkness. After 20 minutes of walking and telling each other how dumb this was, we arrived at the monastery, where I turned on the torch on my phone to find a suitable place to play the game. I unpacked the board and the newspaper, while Dylan got the glass from his jacket pocket, which was far too big, so we had to resort to using a coin. I began to ask the board standard questions, to which there was no response, as we expected. After 10 minutes of messing around with it, we heard some dogs barking in the distance. That alone was a bit creepy. Let me remind you, we were in the middle of the forest, and it was pitch black. Some other kind of animal began to shriek. We thought it was a bird, but it was unlike anything we'd heard before. Suddenly, a cat ran straight past us. We stood up, shocked, and glanced around, half expecting something else to show itself. As quickly as the sound started, they stopped, and it went completely quiet. At this point, we were on edge. Dylan broke the silence by asking if we should try to use the board again. I sat back down while nodding slowly. By then, we weren't even really concentrating on the game, but instead just scanning the tree line and glancing around. I've heard stories like this before, and never understood how people could say they felt watched. But that changed right then. Dylan stood up, not wanting to play the game anymore. As I looked at his face, I saw an expression I'd never seen on it before, one of fear, pure fear. I began packing the bag when we heard heavy footsteps from behind the trees. We just stood there in terror, trying to be as silent as possible. Whatever it was definitely no bear, because we don't have those in Switzerland, not even wolves. But being able to tell from the sound of these steps, this was definitely nothing small. And then, out of nowhere, the smell of rotting meat hit us like a freight train. I've no idea where the smell originated, but it was gut-wrenching, and I could feel bile rising up from my stomach immediately. Without saying a word, Dylan and I bolted down the path that would lead us back. While we ran down the hill, there was something behind us, chasing after us, something bigger and heavier than both of us. We didn't dare look back. As we crossed a river, there was a splashing sound coming from right behind us. It probably tried taking a shortcut by bypassing the bridge. I quickly took a glance back, but I could see nothing but darkness. As we passed the first few street lamps, the footsteps stopped, but that didn't keep us from running another 3 minutes. I lit a cigarette, shaking my head in disbelief as Dylan was losing his mind, asking me what the hell that was. But I had no clue, and to this day, I still don't. Hiking Strangeness from Spookypandaboi. I was born and raised in South Carolina. I've always lived in rural places, so I've never been scared of the wilderness before. But still, I can see how they can be creepy, which is something I actually like. When I was 8 years old, we moved out of my childhood home to live with my grandparents. They had a house built in a nice neighborhood in the middle of the woods. Me and my sisters loved living there, and we explored the woods often. One day, my sister Carly went somewhere with our mom, and our dad was at work. Me and my other sister Katie probably should have stayed inside then, but that would have been boring. We went into the woods and explored areas we hadn't yet discovered. About an hour into our hike, we started up a steep hill when we found something. It was a large, spinal disc. This didn't scare us at first. There was a nearby farm with cattle there, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get out. So if one wandered out here, it could have gotten lost or even attacked by animals, so the bone wasn't too strange. But not too far nearby, we found something else. The strangest looking footprint I'd ever seen. It was shaped like a chicken's foot, but it was massive, far bigger than both of my feet combined. At this point, we were unsettled, but we kept walking anyway, sure that nothing bad could happen. After a few minutes, we heard the loud and unsettling cry of a very large animal, almost bird-like. I was beginning to cry, especially after everything we'd seen. We immediately started running home, but the shrieking got louder. We didn't tell our parents what happened or what we found, because we went outside when we weren't supposed to, and I thought we'd get in trouble. If I told my mom, I knew she wouldn't let us hike anymore. This was the type of thing that would deter most people from ever exploring again, but not me. As I got older, I just got more obsessed and curious. It's been several years since then, and I'm hoping to have even more odd encounters. I'd be happy to, as long as I can remain alive. Okay, so I picked out these stories pretty much randomly as long as they matched the hiking theme. But what I didn't mean to do was pick a bunch of stories about supernatural noises. All these stories had screaming or noises that defied normalcy. So yeah, that was a happy little accident, but I hope you enjoyed it. good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org, or support the show using the links in the description. There's a link to my Patreon, and a link to my merch store. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, about 5 haunted forest stories. Colby Exclusive says, maybe the hairy thing was named Bigger Juicy and got offended that y'all brought someone else with the same name into its territory. Yeah, that could be the reason. Or maybe it was just upset that someone had such a silly nickname. What do you want, says Frog. Well, frogs are nice, so thanks. Lloyd Samuel asks, are these stories really true? They're just allegedly true, friend. There's absolutely no way I can prove these stories, even if they sent potential evidence in with them. If you want true stories, you're gonna have to look into true crime. But around these parts, we enjoy the supernatural, paranormal, and folklore. Murderburger says, my butt's all wet. That's a personal problem, and I hope you got it fixed. Because wet butts are the #1 cause of swamp butt. And Julia Munit says, Poppy Darkness back at it again. I don't think I've ever been called a Poppy, but I like it. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.